There is a moment just before sleep when the mind drifts into the places history refuses to illuminate, a soft edge where something should exist but doesn't. And if you listen closely to that silence, you might feel it too. A faint sense that we arrived in the world carrying memories older than our first written word. Something was lost before we learned how to remember. Something slipped into a dark age before humanity rose. And before you let your body sink fully into this quiet, take a small moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if something in these whispered traces makes you want to stay. If you feel like it, share the place and time where you're listening. I often wonder about the little lights drifting alongside us in the night. It begins with a gap. Not a gap you can see carved into stone or drawn across an old map, but a softer one. A gap of meaning, of memory. A discontinuity in the long shadow of our species. Modern humans appeared on this planet more than 300,000 years ago. Yet the first signs of civilization only emerge around 6,000 years ago. Between those 2 points stretches a silence so immense that even archaeologists struggle to articulate it without drifting into metaphor. It is as if humanity existed for hundreds of millennia in a dimly lit corridor, wandering, learning, losing, surviving, and then suddenly, abruptly, stepped into the full brightness of culture, cities, writing, astronomy, monumental architecture. That leap should have been gradual. It should have been a long unfolding, like the slow bloom of a flower. But the evidence suggests something else, a rapid ignition, a jump. Even cautious researchers have used the phrase sudden emergence, a phrase that quietly contradicts everything we know about cultural evolution. And this contradiction hums like an undercurrent beneath every timeline ever printed, as though our story begins in the middle of a sentence written long before we learned how to speak. What happened in that forgotten opening chapter? What shaped us in the time before history? Why does the archaeological record feel thin, as if entire pages were torn away? Some point to climate instability, others to population fluctuations, migrations, extinctions. But these explanations feel partial, like shadows cast by something larger. When anatomically modern humans expanded across Africa and then outward into the world, they were already capable of symbolic thought, abstract language, planning, creativity. Yet the traces of their early presence, the hints of their emotional worlds, their beliefs, their rudimentary societies, appear and disappear like faint footprints caught in shifting sand. At sites like Blombos Cave in South Africa, engraved ochre pieces date back around 100,000 years, carrying geometric patterns that resemble symbolic notation. Farther north, in the caves of southern Europe, hand stencils and red discs may reach beyond 40,000 years. And somewhere in the quiet dark of Indonesia, a depiction of a warty pig has been dated to more than 45,000 years ago. These are fragments, scattered lights flickering in a vast night. They tell us humans were thinking, imagining, dreaming, long before any civilization is supposed to have existed. So where did that current go? Why does the river of human culture run underground for so long, only to burst to the surface with such force? Some scholars whisper about population bottlenecks, disasters that nearly erased us. The Toba eruption, roughly 74,000 years ago, is one of the darker possibilities. A volcanic winter that may have reduced early human groups to precariously small numbers. But even that does not fill the void, nor does it explain why the earliest signs of complex behavior appear before, not after, such events. Others suggest the traces of early societies simply didn't survive. Wood, fiber, skin, baskets, early structures, most would vanish without a trace. Entire cultures could rise and fade with nothing but a scatter of stones left behind. But this too feels incomplete. If early humans lived in complex groups, shaped rituals, followed celestial patterns, or even formed proto-societies, it is difficult to imagine that nothing more would remain, unless what remained was buried, drowned, burned, eroded, or overwritten, unless time itself conspired to blur the lines. There is another possibility, not favoured, but not dismissed, that the transition was not an invention, but a recovery. That something known once, long ago, fell away. That humanity rediscovered the tools of civilization rather than inventing them from nothing. This idea surfaces quietly in discussions of ancient symbolism, in genetic studies mapping early migrations, in the re-evaluation of sites like Göbekli Tepe, whose intricately carved pillars rise from a period when humans were still considered simple hunter-gatherers. Who teaches hunter-gatherers how to carve stone with astronomical precision? Who whispers geometry into the minds of people who are not yet supposed to understand it? These questions linger, uncomfortable, unanswered. And yet they persist. Even the timeline of our species has shifted repeatedly. Fossils from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco pushed the emergence of modern humans further back than once believed. Genetic studies continue to reveal admixture with archaic hominins we still cannot identify, the so-called ghost populations. We carry traces of beings for whom there is no fossil record, no name, no myth. They walk with us in silence through the strands of our DNA, like forgotten companions from a vanished age. If such populations existed, advanced, primitive, or simply different, what cultures did they carry? What memories died with them? Sometimes the past feels like a palimpsest, a manuscript written, erased, and written over again. Beneath the stories we know may lie older stories, smudged by time, obscured by wind, buried under layers of soil and water. Archaeology exposes a few letters, a handful of strokes, just enough to hint that the original text was longer, richer, stranger. Humanity is a species of forgetting. For every monument that survives, there are thousands that crumbled. For every memory preserved in clay, there are countless thoughts that dissolved into the air before anyone could inscribe them. We stand at the edge of a darkened ocean, looking back across waves carrying fragments of civilizations we no longer remember. And yet, there's a kind of quiet awareness lingering in our collective mind, a sense that our story might have begun twice, or more than twice, a sense that something existed before the rise of Sumer, before Egypt carved its kings, before the Indus Valley shaped its cities. Not a global civilization, perhaps, but a humanity capable of more than we acknowledge. Maybe the earliest chapters were arrayed not by design, but by catastrophe. Maybe they were never written down because writing itself had not yet found its form. Or maybe, and this is the thought that clings to the edge of sleep, someone, at some point, chose which memories would define us. Someone decided what the beginning should look like, and everything before that moment slipped into obscurity. The first clue hides in the silence, in the empty stretch between our biological arrival and our cultural awakening. A silence too deep to be accidental, too symmetrical to be dismissed, too haunting to be ignored. And if this is only the first gap, what waits in the gaps that follow? The quiet after a revelation is often stranger than the revelation itself. The silence that follows the recognition of a gap, vast, cold, unmapped, has a way of forcing the mind toward questions it once avoided. And as the first light of civilization flickers into being across the archaeological record, that silence deepens rather than clears, like mist gathering at the edge of a new horizon. Because the rise of civilization did not unfold as a slow awakening. It was abrupt, concentrated, synchronized across regions that should never have known each other. It happened as though humanity remembered something all at once, like a dream, resurfacing from a long forgotten night. In the plains of Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates, cities emerged with stunning complexity: irrigation, accounting systems, ziggurats measuring the heavens, temples aligned with celestial patterns. No preface, no long prelude of experimentation, just a sudden, confident mastery. Not far away in Egypt, the Nile carried its own revelations. Agricultural calendars, monumental stonework, mortuary traditions laced with cosmology, far too elaborate to belong to a maiden civilization. And on the far side of the subcontinent, the Indus Valley crafted standardized brick cities with drainage systems modern engineers still admire. Three separate cultures, rising almost simultaneously, each presenting a level of sophistication that should have taken countless millennia of trial and error. Yet the archaeological layers beneath these civilizations do not reveal a clear developmental path. They hint, instead, at abrupt transitions. Radiocarbon dates shift like restless shadows. Proto-urban remains appear incomplete, as though the period before complexity had been erased or compressed. Scholars debate whether the earliest administrative tablets of Sumer were born from gradual innovation or came into being because someone, or something, had already conceptualized the system. Even the most careful academic voices have admitted that the sudden appearance of writing is difficult to explain without invoking lost intermediaries. And perhaps it is that word, intermediaries, that unsettles the narrative most, because it gestures toward the possibility that knowledge traveled through channels now forgotten, carried by people whose own origins are blurred by time. Hunters who knew the stars better than they knew the land. Nomads who measured seasons with tools no longer preserved. Survivors of earlier climatic collapses who retained skills their descendants would later mythologize without understanding. These threads weave faintly through global mythologies. Stories of first teachers, culture bringers, civilizing heroes who appear out of nowhere after great destruction. Quetzalcoatl, Oannes, Thoth, Viracocha. Beings described as both human and more than human, emerging from the sea, from the sky, from distant lands where light had dimmed. Historians often interpret these figures metaphorically, yet metaphors usually grow from something real. And across myths separated by oceans, one detail remains consistent. Knowledge arrives abruptly, as if restored, rather than invented. In the archaeological record, a similar pattern forms. At Göbekli Tepe, the oldest known megalithic site, hunter-gatherers crafted stone enclosures with astronomical alignment thousands of years before agriculture's consolidation. They carved animals not merely as representations, but with anatomical precision and symbolic depth. No transitional forms of architecture have been found leading up to this achievement. It exists like a lone island, complete, deliberate, confident, and then buried intentionally by the people who built it. What kind of society erects a monumental site and then seals it beneath layers of earth, as though preserving it for an audience in the distant future? Elsewhere, the pattern persists. Early agricultural communities in the Fertile Crescent exhibit sudden leaps in botanical understanding. The domestication of wheat, barley, and legumes appears fully realized within a short window. Geneticists studying strains of ancient crops have noted unusual patterns. Domestication does not look accidental, it looks orchestrated. And the synchronicity across geographically distant valleys hints that the knowledge may have spread faster than migration alone would allow. Modern humans, as we know them, had existed for hundreds of thousands of years, yet civilization required just a fraction of that time to ignite. It defies elegance. It resists neatness. It challenges the linear model of progress we have been taught to accept. Some researchers have proposed demographic explanations, growing populations, increasing social complexity, technological cascades. But these arguments falter against the abruptness of the transitions. Others suggest the environment stabilized after the Younger Dryas, allowing humanity to flourish. But the end of a climatic freeze should not spontaneously produce mathematics, monumental architecture, astronomy, and complex social hierarchies. These require intellectual lineages, mentors, lessons carried forward, and those lineages do not appear in the archaeological layers preceding the earliest civilizations, unless those layers were lost, unless they existed on coastlines now drowned beneath rising seas, unless they thrived in regions swallowed by desertification, unless whatever humanity achieved before the Holocene was destroyed, erased, scattered, leaving behind only the faintest whispers. When the ice sheets melted, sea levels rose more than 100 meters, drowning the continental shelves where early humans likely lived. If any coastal cultures had developed complex traditions or proto-cities, their remains would now lie underwater. The submerged ruins off the coast of India, Japan, Turkey, and the Caribbean, though controversial, ignite this possibility. Even discoveries like the Yonaguni Monument, though fiercely debated, raise questions. Is the human mind too eager to see patterns in stone? Or are we dismissing evidence because it disrupts the timeline we protect? Archaeologists remain cautious. They must be. But caution can cast its own shadow. The more fiercely a field guards its boundaries, the easier it becomes for anomalies to fall outside the permitted narrative. And anomalies continue to appear. Ancient astronomical knowledge predating known cultures, inexplicable alignments of megaliths with celestial cycles, myths describing events that match geological data no ancient person should have understood. The sudden rise of civilization may not have been sudden at all. Perhaps it was the re-emergence of something older, fragmented, carried across generations, resurfacing when the world became calm enough to receive it. Perhaps those first cities were built not by inventors, but by descendants of survivors trying to restore what had been broken. Or perhaps entirely different human groups existed whose knowledge brushed against our own before vanishing into the fog. And if that is true, then the origins of civilization are not an explosion of brilliance, but a torch passed through darkness. The question that lingers, in the quiet where history thins, is whether those earlier lights were extinguished entirely, or whether fragments still lie beneath silt, beneath myth, beneath the inherited instinct that humanity has done all this before. Something rose before us. Something fell before us. The ruins of that age may remain, not in stone, but in the shape of the questions we keep returning to. And if we follow those questions far enough, what else might we uncover waiting in the layers beneath our beginning? The deeper one looks into the archaeological record, the more the ground itself begins to feel like a layered memory. Not a single story, but many stories, stacked, compacted, blurred. And somewhere within those layers, beneath the familiar chapters of ancient cities and kingdoms, lie older strata that refuse to explain themselves. They sit there quietly, like pages torn from a book, yet still faintly smelling of ink. If the rise of civilization seemed sudden in the previous breaths of our journey, what lies beneath that suddenness feels even stranger. Traces of human settlement that should have led somewhere but did not. Foundations that seem to belong to a lineage of builders whose history has been cut from the spine of time. At Jericho, one of the oldest continuously inhabited sites on Earth, archaeologists uncovered layers so deep that the earliest city walls date back nearly 10,000 years. But beneath even those walls lie remnants of pre-pottery Neolithic settlements, structures built by people who should not have possessed the organizational stability to build defenses. Their mud brick towers rise out of the earth like interrupted thoughts, too advanced for their age, yet too incomplete to belong to a sustained cultural evolution. They appear, flourish briefly, and then vanish, leaving no clear descendants. A flare of brilliance in a dark room, extinguished before it could cast its full glow. Çatalhöyük tells a similar story, a sprawling settlement of interconnected homes, no streets, no hierarchies, no palaces. A proto-urban experiment that seemed to exist in defiance of the typical evolutionary sequence toward civilization. And yet, it emerged suddenly around 9,000 years ago, built with sophistication that should have been the result of thousands of years of incremental development. But again, beneath it, the layers grow thinner and thinner, like a trail fading just as it becomes interesting. It is one of the world's first cities, but it stands without a prologue. Archaeologists know how it ended. They do not know what shaped its origin. And then there is Göbekli Tepe, the place that unsettled everything. A site so ancient that it predates agriculture, pottery, metallurgy, and the wheel, yet bearing megalithic pillars carved with symbolic precision. When the first excavation revealed those T-shaped stones more than 11,000 years old, the archaeological timeline did not simply shift, it trembled. Hunter-gatherers were not supposed to build temples, not supposed to coordinate labor for monumental architecture, not supposed to carve stylized symbolic reliefs of animals and cosmogonic motifs. And yet they did. Worse still, or perhaps more tantalizing, is the realization that Göbekli Tepe is not an anomaly. Its sister sites, still buried under the earth in the region, hint at a network of ritual complexes built by people whose social complexity should have been minimal. And beneath these sites, ground-penetrating surveys reveal even older enclosures, older pillars, older alignments. A deepening mystery. The deeper archaeologists look, the older the story becomes. But the foundations do not lead back to simple structures. They do not devolve into primitive forms. They simply vanish, as if whatever tradition created them began fully formed. It is this vanishing, this abrupt disappearance beneath deeper layers, that invites a troubling thought. What if the origins of these traditions lie in a time before the layers we can currently reach? A time swallowed by climatic upheavals, sea level rise, or the slow violence of wind and erosion. Prehistory is not empty, it is concealed. In Peru, beneath later temples of the Andean world, archaeologists uncovered structures aligned with solstices and cardinal directions. Older than the Inca, older even than the civilizations that preceded them. They appear, in part, like remnants of a much earlier architectural vocabulary. At Göbekli Tepe, buried intentionally by those who built it, the layers themselves are an act of concealment. In Jericho, erosion has erased transitional forms. At Çatalhöyük, the absence of streets suggests an inherited spatial logic, not an invented one. Again and again, humanity encounters structures that imply memory, not innovation. Memory of a time now lost, in the geological folds. And then there are the ruins beneath the sea. Off the coast of India, in the Gulf of Cambay, sonar imaging revealed geometric shapes, stone blocks, and possible foundations lying at depths suggesting they were submerged more than 9,000 years ago, during the last great meltwater pulse. The evidence is contested, but even cautious researchers admit the dating of some artifacts is older than expected. Off the coast of Japan, the Yonaguni Formation remains fiercely debated: natural formation or human modified. Yet its terraces, steps, and carved-looking surfaces sit in a silence that leaves room for possibility. After all, humans build with straight lines because straight lines express intention. Nature favors curves, and when nature mimics intention too closely, uncertainty creeps in. In the Mediterranean, submerged structures off the coast of Greece and Turkey point toward settlements swallowed by rising seas. On the western shores of Europe, legends of Lyonesse and Cantre-Guaylod speak of ancient lands lost beneath the waves, myths that suspiciously align with paleogeographic reconstructions, showing how coastlines receded dramatically after the last ice age. Myths are not evidence, but they are often memory softened by time. The deeper one digs, literally or metaphorically, the more the layers of the world begin to read like a palimpsest. Civilizations built upon older foundations, those foundations upon even older ones, until the earliest layers grow so faint that they dissolve into questions. The missing chapters may not have been erased. They may simply lie beyond the reach of trowel and radiocarbon, preserved only in the shape of the layers themselves. Some anthropologists argue that cultural evolution follows a fractal pattern: sudden bursts of complexity followed by regression, equilibrium, collapse, migration, and re-emergence. If this is true, then earlier cycles could have existed long before recognized civilizations. Cycles erased by ice, forgotten during migrations, or submerged by rising seas. The absence of evidence is not proof of non-existence. It is merely the echo of a world we have not yet rediscovered. And that echo grows louder when one considers the scattered traces of knowledge that appear in places far older than they have any right to be. Proto-writing symbols on cave walls. Early astronomical alignments embedded in stone circles older than agriculture. Calendar systems implied by bone markings tens of thousands of years old. Even the simple fact that early humans understood pigments, adhesives, and composite tools suggests a lineage of understanding deeper than the archaeological record acknowledges. Yet beneath all of this lies a more haunting possibility: that someone, or something, intervened in the layering of memory. Whether intentionally or as a consequence of survival, entire cultural landscapes may have been obscured. When humanity rebuilds after catastrophe, it often does so with urgency, focusing on the future rather than the past. Memories collapse, histories shrink, traditions are rewritten by the victors or by the survivors. The truth becomes sediment. So what remains beneath the cities we know? Beneath the cities we have not yet discovered? Beneath the oceans that drowned our earliest coastlines? Perhaps the foundation stones of humanity's lost age are still there, waiting for someone to brush away the silt. Or perhaps the oldest layers are not physical at all, but encoded in myths, symbols, and instincts older than writing. A memory carried not by stone, but by the quiet feeling that this world is not the first one we have built. And if these layers continue downward, if the foundations beneath foundations point toward a time before the first cities, then the question is no longer whether a dark age existed before humanity's rise. The question becomes far more unsettling: How much deeper do the lost layers go? There is a strange heaviness that settles when the mind drifts toward the period just before the Holocene, a heaviness that feels almost like the echo of something irrevocable, a memory humanity no longer holds, but still reacts to, like the body remembering an injury long after the wound has closed. For if there is any moment in our deep past that resembles a curtain being drawn across an earlier chapter, it is the climatic whiplash of the younger Dryas, a sudden cold snap beginning around 12,900 years ago, followed by an equally abrupt warming only 200 years later. It is not just a climatic event, it is a rupture, a fracture line through time itself. And within that fracture, countless early human cultures vanished without leaving a clear trail behind. The Ice Age had been retreating, slowly, predictably, like a tide drawing away from the shore. Then something happened. Temperatures plunged, glaciers surged, species that had survived for tens of thousands of years disappeared in what felt, geologically speaking, like a single breath. Mammoths, mastodons, saber-toothed cats, the American lion, the giant sloth, the great megafauna that shaped human mythology, all collapsed into extinction or near extinction. And with them, the human cultures that depended on them faltered. Archaeological sites across North America show a sharp decline in the Clovis culture, long considered one of the earliest complex stone tool traditions on the continent. In Europe and Asia, similar declines play out in parallel, though the details vary, as though humanity everywhere suffered a coordinated blow. What makes this period so unsettling is not simply that cultures disappeared, but that the disappearance was synchronized across continents that had no connection. It is the kind of pattern that suggests something global, something catastrophic, something capable of wiping out entire traditions. Some scientists have proposed a cosmic cause, fragments of a disintegrating comet striking northern ice sheets, vaporizing water, triggering wildfires so extensive that soot settled across the globe. The evidence remains debated, but there are curious markers. Strata rich in microspherules, platinum anomalies in Greenland ice cores, soot layers across multiple continents. Whether or not the hypothesis is correct, the Earth clearly experienced a moment of intense trauma. Meltwater pulses surged into the oceans, altering currents and climate systems. Sea levels rose rapidly. Habitats changed faster than human groups could adapt. If any early cultures had developed forms of proto-civilization during the late Pleistocene, seasonal gathering sites, ritual centers, symbolic traditions, artistic lineages, this upheaval would have scattered them like dust. The survivors would have migrated, regrouped, forgotten, relearned, rebuilt. Trauma does not preserve memory. It erases it, reshaping it into legends of destruction. And indeed, global mythologies echo with stories of a world shattered by fire, flood, ice, falling stars, and long winters that swallowed entire peoples. But beneath the myth lies something quieter: archaeological evidence of abandoned settlements, cultural transitions, and unexplained gaps. In Europe, for example, the Magdalenian culture, creators of some of the most breathtaking cave art, gradually gives way to other traditions whose origins remain partially obscured. In North America, the Clovis transition remains one of prehistory's most debated puzzles. In Siberia, human groups retreat and reappear in erratic patterns inconsistent with slow cultural evolution. These patterns do not suggest a linear progression, they suggest interruption. And it is within this interruption that the possibility of an earlier cultural flowering, a forgotten stage of human creativity, becomes plausible. The drop in genetic diversity around this time suggests population bottlenecks that could have fragmented knowledge networks. Early traditions of toolmaking, navigation, symbolic systems, or ritual practice may have been lost before they could fossilize into long lasting forms. Entire intellectual lineages may have vanished with the people who carried them. Geologists studying paleoclimate records speak of the Younger Dryas not simply as a cold period, but as a moment of global reorganization. Ecosystems shifted, coastlines changed shape, glacial lakes burst in catastrophic floods. Some of the most violent freshwater discharges in Earth's history occurred as ice dams collapsed. If humans lived along river systems, coastlines, or fertile valleys, which they almost certainly did, their settlements would have been destroyed, erased, buried beneath sediment, or drowned beneath rising seas. Archaeologists know this indirectly by studying what survived. Scattered artifacts in disturbed layers, hints of earlier traditions, abrupt changes in technology. The Clovis points of North America, once thought to represent the earliest culture, now look more like the remnants of a lineage cut short. The Solutrean hypothesis, suggesting early migration from Ice Age Europe to North America, has been largely dismissed, yet some stone tool similarities remain curious. They might not imply direct contact, but they do suggest shared or parallel traditions older than the present archaeological record. Elsewhere, ancient rock shelters show layers of ash from fires so widespread that they can only be explained by environmental calamity. In Africa, genetic evidence suggests human populations contracted severely, only to expand again in the early Holocene. In Australia, megafaunal extinctions coincide with climatic disruptions. Again and again, the story repeats. A thriving pattern, a sudden interruption, an uncertain recovery. And yet what emerged after the Younger Dryas was not the slow, hesitant rebirth described by most textbooks. Instead, almost immediately after climatic stabilization, humanity entered a period of rapid innovation. Agriculture, permanent settlements, larger social groups, monumental constructions. It is as though the species had been waiting, holding something in reserve, like a seed preserved through winter finally finding warmth. That transition is too swift, too coordinated, too confident to dismiss as coincidence. Could it be that knowledge survived the dark age in fragments, carried in the minds of small groups, scattered across continents, waiting for conditions to allow rebuilding? Could early astronomical traditions, ritual structures, or artistic concepts have been remnants of something practiced before the world froze? The symbolism at Göbekli Tepe, with its animal reliefs, celestial motifs, and apparent calendrical alignments, becomes more provocative in this light. It appears not as the first experiment of a new age, but as something older, resurfacing. Even in the Americas, stories preserved by indigenous groups recall an age before the cold, a time of giant animals, lush landscapes, and humans traveling great distances. These memories, though mythologized, carry enough ecological detail to suggest long oral traditions. Oral memory can survive thousands of years, but trauma compresses it into allegory. Fire becomes a celestial serpent. Cold becomes a sleeping sky. Lost peoples become spirits swallowed by the earth. When researchers examine sediment cores, pollen records, and isotopic signatures, they find a world violently reorganized, a world that would have forced human cultures to dissolve and reconstitute. But archaeology, limited by what survives, cannot easily trace those dissolved lineages. It can only gesture toward them through anomalies, unexplained skill sets, sudden changes, persistent myths of ancestors who lived before the world was remade. And so the question grows heavier, not lighter. If the younger Dryas acted as a veil drawn across humanity's earliest complexity, what did it hide? What traditions, knowledge systems, or proto-societies fell into the cold and never rose again? And if fragments survived, buried beneath later layers, how many more remnants wait in places we have not yet dug? Perhaps the true mystery is not what the younger Dryas destroyed, but what it allowed to be forgotten. And as the warmth returned and the ice retreated, humanity emerged into a world reset, carrying only the faintest memories of what came before. If that was not the first reset, how many more lie buried beneath the ice of earlier ages? There is a peculiar loneliness in the thought that entire branches of humanity once walked this planet, yet left behind almost nothing except faint echoes in our DNA. These echoes hum beneath the surface of the human genome like distant voices belonging to populations without names, without artifacts, without recognized histories. Populations that geneticists call ghost lineages. Their existence is inferred not from fossils or tools, but from mathematical signatures embedded in us, as if the body itself remembers encounters that the archaeological record has forgotten. And these forgotten people complicate the story of humanity far more deeply than most textbooks allow. For years, the narrative seemed simple enough. Modern humans emerged in Africa, spread outward, interbred with Neanderthals and Denisovans, and slowly populated the earth. But the deeper geneticists looked, the more the story began to fray. They found signals that did not belong to any known group, segments of DNA that aligned with no fossil specimen, traces of admixture with hominins whose bones we have never found. It was as though an entire cast of characters had been deleted from the script, yet their lines remained. One example comes from studies of West African populations, where researchers discovered that up to 19% of their genome may originate from an unidentified archaic group, one that diverged from the human lineage even earlier than Neanderthals and Denisovans. There are no fossils associated with this group, no sites, no tools, only the lingering genetic imprint of an encounter lost to time. In Southeast Asia and Oceania, certain genetic signatures point toward contact with yet another unknown hominin. Neither Neanderthal nor Denisovan, but something else entirely. Something with which anatomically modern humans shared land, food, fears, and perhaps even ideas. These ghost lineages are not merely curiosities. They suggest something profound, that the world of early Homo sapiens was not empty but crowded, that multiple human species overlapped, coexisted, and interacted in ways we barely understand. And if these populations had stable societies, cultural practices, symbolic traditions, or proto-languages, and many likely did, then entire chapters of human cultural evolution may have vanished along with them. The silence of the archaeological record regarding these groups is not surprising. Fossils are rare. Preservation is selective. Tropical environments, where many of these populations lived, erase bones quickly. Early structures made of organic materials dissolve into soil. The absence of evidence may simply be the cost of time, humidity, and chance. But genetic memory persists where physical memory fails. And it raises unnerving questions. If we carry the traces of these unknown peoples, what else might we have inherited from them? Did some of the ideas, instincts, or symbolic capacities we assume to be uniquely ours actually emerge from ancient encounters with other humans? Could the sudden appearance of certain cultural traits, counting systems, cosmological ideas, burial practices, reflect not invention, but exchange across species boundaries? There are hints: Neanderthals, once caricatured as primitive, now appear far more complex. They used pigments. They created composite tools. They may have painted cave walls in Spain nearly 65,000 years ago, long before Homo sapiens arrived there. They engraved patterns on bones and shells. They appear to have buried their dead. Denisovans left behind jewelry fashioned with advanced drilling techniques. These were not primitive beings. They were alternative branches of humanity with their own intellectual trajectories. If some of their traits lived on in us, woven invisibly through our genome, then the human story becomes not a single line, but a braided river. Numerous streams converging, merging, splitting, and somewhere within this braided flow lie the ghost populations whose contributions we cannot trace through anything except the quiet mathematics of genetic divergence. Equally mysterious are the bottlenecks that have been detected in human history. Dramatic reductions in population size that compress diversity, erase lineages, and reset cultural landscapes. One such bottleneck appears around 70,000 years ago. Another may have occurred around 15,000 years ago. Each time, the effect would have been catastrophic. Small groups surviving, isolated, carrying only fragments of the knowledge that once existed. Imagine a lineage that developed unique skills for navigation along ancient coasts, lost when their people perished in a volcanic event. Imagine a group possessing symbolic rights that vanished when sea level rise consumed their settlements. Imagine a population whose language held concepts now absent from the human mind. When they disappeared, the world would not remember them, but fragments of their genes would persist, scattered in the living. And so what we call humanity becomes a mosaic assembled from ancestors we can name and ancestors we cannot. A mosaic shaped not only by survival but by loss. Because every branch that vanished took with it a different possible future, a different intellectual heritage. The human story might have unfolded very differently if certain populations had endured, if their traditions had blended with ours. What if one of the ghost lineages held knowledge we later rediscovered, or failed to rediscover? There are other clues hidden in the genome, patterns of selection that hint at adaptations acquired far earlier than our archaeological timeline suggests. Genes associated with altitude, cold tolerance, immune resistance, or metabolic efficiency, sometimes more consistent with lifestyles that predate our known migrations. There are even genetic traces suggesting that modern humans in the Americas may have distantly interacted with an archaic population linked to Eastern Asia, one that left little physical evidence behind. This raises a haunting possibility. What if early Homo sapiens inherited fragments of culture not only biologically, but cognitively? What if some of the sudden leaps in symbolic behavior, the engraved ochres, the bone flutes, the early calendars, were influenced by encounters with human groups whose traditions have since evaporated? In this light, the abrupt emergence of civilization after the Younger Dryas looks less like a spontaneous invention and more like the reassembly of scattered legacies. Each surviving lineage carried a different piece of the memory. Only when the world stabilized did these pieces recombine, forming the mosaic of culture we call civilization. And yet, something still feels missing. The ghost lineages illuminate the shadows around humanity, but they do not fill the deeper void, the sense that not only people but entire eras have been forgotten. Genetic echoes show who touched us, but not what they knew. To understand that, one must look beyond DNA into the faint signs of human presence that appear at sites far older than expected. Handprints deep in caves, footprints pressed into ancient mud, pigments surviving in protected shelters. At Letoli in Tanzania, footprints more than 3.6 million years old remind us how fragile the record is. A single rainfall could have washed them away forever. At Lake Mungo in Australia, burials more than 40,000 years old show ritual complexity long before any known civilization. In South Africa, engraved bones and ochres speak of symbolic mines predating agriculture by tens of millennia. These fragments survive only through accident. How many others have vanished? The existence of ghost populations forces us to consider how much of humanity's story is irretrievably lost. If entire species of humans can vanish with barely a trace, then entire societies, traditions, or proto-civilizations could vanish just as easily. Genetic memory is patient, but cultural memory is not. It dissolves with the bodies that carry it. This is what makes the silence in the archaeological record so unsettling. Not that we lack evidence, but that we now know evidence once existed and disappeared. The ghost lineages tell us that absence is not emptiness, it is erasure. And if there were humans whose names we will never know, traditions we will never recover, and stories woven into us without explanation, then the simplest and most haunting question rises quietly from the buried strata of our past. If these forgotten lineages touched us so deeply, what else has humanity inherited from worlds we can no longer remember? There is something unsettling about stones that refuse to tell their age. Stones are supposed to be patient witnesses. They endure fire, water, and wind. They hold shadows of the people who shaped them. And yet, scattered across the world are structures carved from stone whose origins dissolve the closer one looks. They stand not as monuments to what we know, but as reminders of what we have forgotten. They resist dating techniques. They contradict stratigraphy. They whisper of hands that shaped them in an era that should not have had the knowledge to do so. And it is in these mute stones that the outline of a forgotten human chapter begins to take form. Archaeologists often speak with a cautious reverence about orphan monuments, structures that do not belong to the civilizations built above them. They are foundations that seem older than their cities, stones quarried and shaped before the cultures that inherited them arrived. In some cases, the original builders vanished so completely that only the reused stones survived. Like borrowed voices in someone else's song, these anomalies appear across continents, as though humanity once possessed a shared architectural intuition that later generations only dimly remembered. In the Andean highlands, beneath Inca walls renowned for their precision, lie stones even more masterfully carved. At Sacsayhuaman, blocks weighing dozens of tons fit together with such tight tolerances that a blade of grass cannot slip between them. Yet these stones sit beneath later Inca masonry, rougher and less refined. The Incas themselves admitted they did not build the oldest foundations, they inherited them. The same pattern repeats in Cusco, Ollantaytambo, and Machu Picchu. Older stones are larger, more precise, more resistant to seismic force, and more enigmatic. Their weathering patterns suggest a great age, but radiocarbon dating cannot measure stone, and the quarries from which they were cut reveal no tools sharp enough to justify the smoothness of the joints. In the Mediterranean, at Baalbek in Lebanon, the trilithon stones, some weighing over 800 tons, rest beneath Roman constructions. Romans expanded the site, but the massive foundation stones belong to an earlier era. No written record describes their placement. The Romans themselves never claimed to have moved them. They simply built on top of what was already there. Even today, engineers debate whether the technology to move such stones existed before advanced mechanical advantage was understood. If it did, then that knowledge disappeared long before recorded history. Göbekli Tepe, though often described as a ritual complex, contains pillars so large and so intricately carved that the logistics of their construction baffle researchers. Without draft animals, without metal tools, and without agricultural surplus, hunter-gatherers supposedly quarried, shaped, and transported monoliths exceeding 10 tons. Yet beneath these visible enclosures lie older ones, detected through subsurface imaging, deeper, larger, more complex. The deeper layers appear not more primitive but more elaborate, as though the site's earliest expressions were its most advanced. This inversion of expected development challenges the assumption that human architectural skill evolved linearly. On the other side of the world, the Moai of Easter Island stand on platforms known as ahu, many of which contain construction phases predating the iconic statues. The oldest Ehu stones are heavily weathered, far more than the statues themselves. It is as if earlier builders erected platforms long before the later culture carved its monoliths, only to repurpose those foundations without fully understanding their origins. Even in Japan, the enigmatic Ishino Hoden, a massive, partially carved stone left abandoned, suggests techniques lost to time. Its size rivals that of ancient megalithic stones elsewhere, yet no one knows who began shaping it or why the carving stopped. The workmanship implies an intention never fulfilled, a project interrupted by forces unknown. And then there are stones beneath the sea. Off the coast of Yonaguni, Japan, terraces, steps, and geometric features give the impression of an underwater monument. Debates rage over whether natural processes could produce shapes so reminiscent of human design. But even if nature carved them, the coincidence remains troubling when compared with other submerged formations. Ruins off Cuba, pavements off Malta, possible walls off Bimini. Sea level rise after the last ice age submerged vast stretches of coastal land. If humans built structures on those vanished shores, their oldest works would now rest beneath the waves. Archaeologists are trained to interpret stones conservatively, but stones do not always cooperate. Some structures show tool marks inconsistent with the cultures usually associated with them. Some display erosion patterns implying ages far beyond conventional timelines. Others demonstrate technological knowledge that appears abruptly and then vanishes. The world is full of stones that seem to belong to an unremembered era. What makes these stones so haunting is not simply their mystery, but the pattern they form. They suggest a lineage of craftsmanship, an architectural intelligence that flares briefly, disappears, then re-emerges centuries or millennia later in unrelated places. The massive polygonal walls of Peru resemble the Cyclopean masonry of the Mediterranean. The precision joints at Pumapunku in Bolivia echo stone-cutting methods found thousands of miles away. These similarities may be coincidental, arising from convergent cultural innovation. And yet, something about the global pattern feels like the faint memory of an earlier age resurfacing in fragments. It raises a possibility rarely spoken aloud in academic circles. Perhaps the timeline of megalithic construction is incomplete. Perhaps the oldest builders left no written records because writing had not yet been developed, or because their records were kept on perishable materials long since decayed. If humans experimented with monumental architecture before the end of the last ice age, those earliest attempts would now be buried beneath sediment or submerged by rising seas. And this opens a further, more subtle question. Why do so many of these ancient structures align with stars? At Nabta Playa in the Nubian desert, stone circles older than Stonehenge appear to track solstices and certain star risings. At Göbekli Tepe, carved animals may correspond to constellations, though the interpretation is debated. In Europe, megalithic alignments stretch across landscapes, following solar and lunar cycles with uncanny precision. These alignments imply a continuity of sky watching older than agriculture itself. If early humans understood celestial cycles deeply, then monumental architecture may have arisen from traditions far older than the visible structures. Yet the origins of this sky-oriented tradition are lost. The earliest evidence appears already mature, already intentional, as if inherited. If such an inheritance existed, who were the first recipients, and from whom did they inherit? Archaeology offers no direct answer, only an accumulation of anomalies. Stones too old to date, foundations too precise for their supposed era, alignments too sophisticated to dismiss as coincidence. These anomalies are not proof of a forgotten civilization, but they are proof of forgotten knowledge. And forgotten knowledge implies forgotten people. Perhaps the earliest builders lived in a world reshaped by climate, forced to move, forced to adapt, forced to abandon their monumental expressions as ice advanced or seas rose. Perhaps their descendants resurfaced later, carrying fragments of old techniques, but not the full lineage. Techniques degrade when memory fades. Knowledge erodes when populations fracture. A master craft becomes a mystery when its practitioners vanish. And yet, the stones remain stubborn, silent, uncooperative. They resist tidy categorization. They stand as reminders that time is not linear and human development not smooth. That beneath our known history lies a terrain of abandoned traditions, half-remembered skills, and architectural whispers carved into mountainside and coast. If the stones we cannot date belong to an era unrecorded, then humanity's past stretches deeper than we allow ourselves to imagine. A past where people looked at the sky with knowledge we have misplaced. A past where builders shaped stones with methods we cannot replicate. A past not erased, but buried, waiting for those willing to listen. And perhaps the only question that truly matters, as we sift through these mute foundations, is whether the stones themselves are trying to remind us of something we are not yet ready to remember. There is a strange intimacy in the way early humans left marks on stone, as though they were whispering across tens of millennia to whoever would come after them. Not with words, but with symbols. Patterns carved, painted, scratched, and repeated across continents long before the rise of writing. These signs are older than agriculture, older than cities, older even than many human migrations. And what makes them unsettling is not merely their age, but their persistence. They appear and reappear across vast distances as if echoes of a shared language spoken in a forgotten age. For decades, cave art was viewed primarily as decoration or rituals tied to hunting. But as researchers catalogued the symbols, a strange pattern emerged. Genevieve von Petzinger, studying Ice Age cave signs across Europe, identified a set of recurring motifs: lines, dots, spirals, chevrons, crosshatches, claviforms, hand stencils, and other shapes that seem deceptively simple. Yet these shapes appear consistently across sites separated by thousands of years and hundreds of kilometers. Some are found from Spain to Turkey, from France to Siberia. Their longevity is astonishing. Certain forms persisted for over 30,000 years. The simplest explanation is that these signs represented a proto-symbolic system. Not writing exactly, but not mere decoration either. Something in between. A visual code. The fact that it remained stable for so long suggests cultural transmission on a scale far greater than previously believed. And this, in turn, implies that the communities who used these signs shared concepts, traditions, and perhaps even forms of memory across time and space. But the deeper one looks, the stranger the pattern becomes. Certain symbols appear in contexts that imply more than ritual: a vertical line beside a horizontal one, a series of dots arranged like a primitive tally, triangles near depictions of animals, spiral motifs near celestial alignments in later megaliths. Some researchers quietly wonder whether these signs might represent early attempts at recording time, lunar cycles, migration patterns, breeding seasons. At least one study suggests that certain dot and line combinations near animal figures might indicate seasonal markers, implying a rudimentary calendar system long before agriculture required one. If that is true, then the origins of timekeeping may predate civilization by tens of thousands of years. And if timekeeping existed, so too might planning, forecasting, and structured ritual. Even more remarkable are the astronomical hints embedded in these signs. At Lascaux, the positions of certain animals correspond roughly to constellations, though the interpretation remains contested. At the cave of La Pasiega, a red ladder-like symbol has been dated to more than 64,000 years ago, predating Homo sapiens in that region, suggesting Neanderthals painted it. This raises profound questions. Did symbolic systems originate before Homo sapiens? Were they inherited from earlier humans? Or did multiple human species converge independently upon similar symbolic expressions? Each possibility points toward a complex intellectual lineage that does not align neatly with the idea of humans learning symbolism only at the dawn of civilization. The hands, though, the hands are the most haunting. Stenciled negative hands pressed onto cave walls across France, Spain, Indonesia, and beyond. Many are small, possibly belonging to women or adolescents. Some lack fingers, possibly as a form of coded gesture rather than injury. They feel like signatures, declarations that say, "We were here, and we understood the world in ways you will not grasp easily." Hands are not symbols. Hands are identities. They speak of lineage, of continuity. If these symbols were part of a proto-language, then the people who left them were not simply painting. They were communicating across time. But communication implies meaning, and meaning implies a shared intellectual framework, which leads to a deeper question. Where did that framework come from? Symbolic systems do not emerge in isolation. They grow from stories, from traditions, from the slow accumulation of collective knowledge. And yet these symbols appear fully formed in the oldest caves, without obvious ancestral forms. They begin as if they were already known. Even more intriguing are the similarities between these Ice Age symbols and later Neolithic markings, those found on megalithic stones, on pottery fragments, on early tokens used for accounting. It is as if an ancient symbolic lineage stretches from the depths of caves into the surface world of early farming societies. A lineage that did not die when climates changed or populations shifted, only transformed. This continuity challenges the assumption that writing emerged suddenly in Sumer, Egypt, or the Indus Valley. It suggests that writing may have roots in far older symbolic traditions, passed down through thousands of generations of oral memory. And if such a tradition existed, then somewhere in that deep past, humanity may have possessed intellectual frameworks that our current histories fail to acknowledge. Another layer to this mystery emerges in the geometries of early carvings. Spirals, concentric circles, and radial patterns appear in Paleolithic caves, then in megalithic art, and later in Bronze Age iconography. These shapes often correspond to astronomical cycles, solstices, lunar phases, solar paths. Even the famous labyrinth symbol, found in cultures from Scandinavia to India, appears to have prehistoric origins. How did such a complex, consistent motif spread across continents long before large-scale migration is believed to have occurred? There are two possibilities. Either humanity carried a deep symbolic inheritance dating back to its earliest movements out of Africa, a cultural seed that blossomed repeatedly in different regions, or symbolic traditions spread through networks far older and more extensive than known archaeological evidence supports. Both possibilities point to a world more interconnected, more sophisticated, and more intellectually rich than the standard narrative of early humans allows. The symbols also complicate the timeline of human cognition. If Paleolithic people understood abstraction and symbolism deeply, why didn't civilization appear sooner? Why is there such a vast gap, tens of thousands of years, between the first symbols and the first cities? Perhaps civilization did appear sooner, in forms we no longer recognize. Perhaps symbolic systems flourished in early coastal cultures or river valleys later submerged. Perhaps the symbolic languages of the Paleolithic were a legacy from earlier human groups, groups erased by climatic upheaval or absorbed into later populations. Or perhaps human consciousness itself cycles through phases, expanding in bursts, contracting in others. Symbolic expression may have been one such burst, occurring long before material complexity followed. And then there is the deepest question of all, one that slips into the mind when staring at a handprint or a carved spiral. Were these symbols meant for us? Did their creators intend them to be messages to the future, to warn, to record, to remember? Or were they simply expressions of a worldview that no longer exists? A worldview shaped by stars, seasons, spirits, and landscapes we have since lost? The truth is unknowable, but the symbols remain, stubborn, ancient, persistent. They belong to a lineage that stretches beneath recorded history like an underground river. A river that continues to flow, even if most of its channels have been sealed by time. Perhaps humanity did not invent symbolism where our textbooks say we did. Perhaps we merely rediscovered it, like an old melody heard faintly through walls of stone. And if the symbols we find today are shadows of a much older language, then one must wonder, how many meanings lie hidden in those marks, waiting for a mind capable of remembering a world older than civilization itself? There is a kind of quiet that hangs over the world's oldest stories. A quiet that feels deliberate, like breath held too long. When ancient cultures speak of a time before the great floods, before the reshaping of continents and the reordering of the sky, their voices tremble with something more than myth. They speak of memory, a memory softened by retelling, wrapped in metaphor, but carrying the weight of something lived. And it is in the silence after these stories, in the pause between catastrophe and rebirth, that the outline of an unexplained dark age emerges again. An age that seems to exist just beyond the reach of our archaeology, yet too consistent across cultures to dismiss. Nearly every civilization on Earth preserves a flood narrative. Mesopotamia records it in the Epic of Gilgamesh, the gods deciding to erase humanity. The Greeks spoke of Deucalion and Pyrrha. Hindu texts describe Manu surviving a deluge warned by a fish. Indigenous Australian stories recall rising seas separating lands that were once continuous. The Maya told of worlds wiped clean before the present one. In North America, dozens of tribes preserved memories of floods, tsunamis, and skies falling with fire. On Pacific islands, the sea rises without mercy, swallowing entire homelands. What is remarkable is not the ubiquity of the flood myth, but the shared structure, a world before, a cataclysm, a small group that survives, a reset, a loss of knowledge, then silence. Flood myths are not archaeological evidence, but geological evidence shows that the world experienced dramatic sea level rise at the end of the last ice age, more than 100 meters in some regions. Entire continental shelves drowned. Coastlines retreated miles inland. Any culture living along those fertile coasts would have disappeared without leaving more than a few scattered traces. If people built settlements, cultivated plants, or established proto-cities along those ancient shores, the ocean now guards their remains. But the myths hint at more than drowning. They hint at a world that existed before, a world with its own rules, its own traditions. A world erased so thoroughly that only its ending survives in memory. Take the Sumerian king list. Before the flood, it describes reigns lasting thousands of years, impossible by modern standards, yet serving a symbolic purpose. The idea that the world before the flood operated differently. After the flood, reign lengths shorten dramatically. Time changes. Human life changes. The world is reset. Egyptian texts echo this pattern. They speak of the Zep Tepi, the first time, a golden age ruled by gods or semi-divine beings. After a transformative event, the world enters a new epoch, one of human kingship rather than divine rule. This is not merely mythology, it is the framework through which Egyptians understood time itself, a cycle segmented by rupture. The Maya conceived of previous worlds destroyed by water or darkness before the current world was formed. Hindu cosmology describes repeated destructions and creations, each separated by floods or cosmic dissolution. These are not identical stories, but they revolve around a shared axis, the idea of a world-ending event that marks the boundary between a forgotten age and the one humanity actually records. But what is most curious is the strange confidence with which ancient people insisted that knowledge existed before the flood, knowledge that was not fully recovered afterward. In Mesopotamia, the seven sages, the Apkallu, were said to have brought civilization to humans before the flood. Afterward, fewer remained, and their knowledge was diminished. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl was the teacher of arts and sciences who lived before catastrophe struck. In Polynesia, Maui is credited with raising lands that had been submerged. These figures are mythic, yes, but they are also symbolic placeholders for something humanity sensed but could not articulate. Continuity broken. Archaeology mirrors this tension. When looking at the end of the Pleistocene, one sees a scatter of abandoned sites, interrupted traditions, and sudden disappearances of material culture. Cave art traditions stop abruptly in some regions. Symbolic systems fragment. Technologies regress in certain places only to reappear later. Even population genetics shows evidence of shifts, bottlenecks, and expansions consistent with major disruption. The silence that follows these disruptions is often mistaken for emptiness, but silence can be the residue of trauma. After catastrophe, people rebuild quickly, but with different priorities. Rituals change. Knowledge survives unevenly. Oral stories become the container for what cannot be rebuilt materially. Some researchers argue that the sudden appearance of agriculture in multiple regions around the same time suggests either parallel innovation or shared memory, perhaps of plants once cultivated before the flood destroyed earlier landscapes. Others note that early astronomical knowledge, such as lunar counting systems and solstice alignments, appears mature immediately after the Younger Dryas, implying a continuity of skywatching that predates the cataclysm. There is a particularly haunting example in the ruins of Çatalhöyük. Buried beneath the layers of its early settlement are reliefs of bulls, vultures, and geometric patterns. Some of these motifs echo much older Paleolithic art, suggesting that symbolic traditions survived the transition into the Holocene, not as innovation but as inheritance, a memory carried across millennia of upheaval. But even as echoes survive, something else is missing. Myths describe a sophistication before the flood that humanity struggles to recover. They describe beings who knew the stars, who built with intention, who shaped landscapes. These details are often dismissed as poetic exaggerations, yet they consistently portray a time when knowledge was more complete, when the world itself was young, not in years, but in clarity. Perhaps the flood myths do not refer to a single event, but to a series of regional catastrophes. Sea level rise, glacial lake outbursts, tsunamis triggered by landslides or cometary debris. Each culture preserved its own version, shaped by its experience. But beneath the variations lies a shared emotional truth, a world that was lost and a world that began again. The silence after these stories, the gap in the archaeological record, hints at a broader phenomenon. When humanity passed through the late Pleistocene catastrophes, it did not merely lose people. It lost memory. It lost stability. It lost the slow cultural accumulation that might otherwise have led to earlier civilizations. And in that void, myths took root. Myths became the last fragile threads connecting humanity to the age before the world drowned. It is tempting to dismiss these stories as symbolic narratives explaining natural disasters. But one cannot ignore the persistence, the way cultures separated by oceans and millennia tell the same shape of story, as though drawing from a common well. If the myths are shadows of real events, then what they describe is not simply destruction, but transition, the end of one human world and the beginning of another. Which leads to a quiet, uneasy thought. If humanity already experienced one such reset, how many more might lie hidden beneath the sediments of older floods, older collapses, older silences? And if the pre-flood world held memories we no longer possess, perhaps the question is not whether an earlier age existed, but whether we will ever learn to hear what the silence after the flood is still trying to say. There is a subtle unease that settles in the mind when looking at a map of ancient human migrations, not because of what is shown, but because of what is missing. Human presence appears in places far earlier than models predict. Cultures arise where they should not have had time to develop. Footprints appear on landscapes supposedly uninhabitable, and if one follows these anomalies carefully, a strange pattern emerges. Humanity seems to have reached certain corners of the world too early, too skillfully, or with knowledge that contradicts the timeline we have drawn for ourselves. These are places humans were not supposed to reach. Not yet, not then. And yet, they did. One of the most striking examples lies high in the Andes, where archaeological evidence shows human presence at altitudes exceeding 14,000 feet more than 12,000 years ago. These elevations are unforgiving even today, requiring acclimatization, specialized survival strategies, and knowledge of high-altitude ecology. Yet early humans reached them with seeming confidence. They left behind tools, shelters, and traces of diet showing careful adaptation to extreme environments. Nothing about this should feel normal. Evolution does not prepare a species for high-altitude living unless it has a reason. And humans appear in these heights almost immediately after arriving in South America. The same discomfort arises when examining early settlement in Australia, where humans arrived at least 50,000 years ago, crossing open ocean channels requiring boats or rafts far beyond what the archaeological record suggests existed at the time. Even conservative models admit that accidental drift is unlikely to explain such a journey. These early Australians understood navigation, tides, materials, and winds. And they reached not only the northern coasts, but rapidly spread across the continent, adapting to desert, rainforest, and savanna with astonishing speed. Their rock art, some of the oldest in the world, depicts beings, animals, and structures that suggest memory of landscapes lost to rising seas. Then there is the mystery of the Americas more generally. For decades, the Clovis first model insisted humans arrived no earlier than 13,000 years ago. But site after site broke this boundary. Monteverde in Chile, with its well-preserved wooden structures and medicinal plants, may reach back 18,000 years. Bluefish Caves in the Yukon reveals cut-marked bones perhaps 24,000 years old. In White Sands, New Mexico, human footprints mingled with those of giant sloths, and mammoths have been dated to over 21,000 years. Footprints that show interaction, hunting, and strategy. Humanity did not simply drift into these continents. They arrived with intention, with capability, with knowledge. Yet the traditional timeline has no place for such knowledge. The maps we draw for the ancient world underestimate our ancestors, or misunderstand their past. Early seafaring appears again in the Mediterranean, where obsidian from the island of Melos has been found in mainland Greek sites dating back 10,000 years. But obsidian cannot be collected accidentally. It requires a journey, a deliberate voyage across open water. And these early mariners had not yet built cities or developed formal agriculture. They moved across the sea because they could, or because they remembered something. Even more perplexing are the settlements submerged along the coasts of northern Europe. Doggerland, the landmass that once connected Britain to continental Europe, now rests beneath the North Sea. Archaeological evidence from dredged sediments reveals human habitation, tools, hearths, and remnants of structures. This was a world that humans once knew intimately, and when it disappeared beneath rising waters, entire cultures must have vanished with it, leaving no trace except what the sea occasionally gives up as fragmented offerings. A similar story unfolds along the coasts of India, Japan, Southeast Asia, and the Americas. In the Gulf of Cambay, sonar scans reveal rectilinear patterns suggestive of ancient settlement, possibly older than any known city. Off the coast of Japan, the Yonaguni Formation, whether carved intentionally or shaped by nature, sits within a corridor of other submerged features, hinting at human modification. Off Cuba, underwater formations rest at depths consistent with submergence more than 10,000 years ago. None of these prove advanced civilization existed before the Holocene, but collectively they whisper that human presence in these places predates written memory. Even the deserts contain anomalies. In the Sahara, beneath sand dunes and eroded rock, satellite imagery reveals ancient river systems and possible settlement grids, evidence of human activity in what was once a fertile grassland. This green Sahara was inhabited repeatedly over tens of thousands of years, but the cultural fragments that emerge from these layers appear sophisticated, ritualistic, symbolic. Rock engravings portray boats, cattle, astronomically aligned structures. The people who lived here had a way of organizing their world that suggests inheritance rather than invention. All of these places, the high Andes, the Australian coastlines, the submerged lands of the North Sea, the forgotten Saharan waterways, share one trait. They reveal human capabilities earlier than expected. Capabilities that hint at a more mobile, adaptive, knowledgeable humanity than the timeline allows. But there is another layer to the puzzle. Some sites contain knowledge that early humans should not have possessed. Ancient star maps, such as those implied in Aboriginal traditions, align with constellations far older than the cultures preserving them. The Denisova cave yielded artifacts drilled with such precision that they suggest techniques lost for tens of thousands of years. The Piri race map, drawn in the 16th century but based on older sources, contains strangely accurate depictions of coastlines that would have been visible only before they were covered with ice. If these examples stood alone, they could be dismissed as chance, misinterpretation, or anomaly. But across the world, they accumulate. They form a quiet, persistent pattern. Early humans were not wandering blindly into uncharted lands. They were expanding into spaces where their adaptability suggests either inherited memory or forgotten precedent. One cannot help but wonder whether humanity once navigated the world more skillfully than we assume. Whether early groups possessed knowledge that later collapsed during climatic upheavals, population bottlenecks, or the loss of cultural continuity. Knowledge that resurfaced sporadically in isolated regions, giving the appearance of anomalous sophistication. And yet, the most unsettling question does not come from the anomalies themselves, but from the gaps surrounding them. Why do these traces appear without clear lineages? Why does advanced knowledge surface briefly, then vanish for millennia before reappearing in recognized civilizations? Why do so many early settlements show signs of abrupt abandonment, as if emptied by sudden necessity? Perhaps humans reached these places too soon because they were not exploring. They were fleeing. The end of the Pleistocene was marked by dramatic climate change, floods, and ecological collapse. People moved because they had to, and as they moved, they carried fragments of knowledge from worlds that no longer exist. Or perhaps humans reached these places at precisely the right time because they were following routes mapped long before, by ancestors whose stories are lost to erosion, sea level rise, and the slow decay of organic memory. The question that lingers in the quiet edges of the archaeological record is disarmingly simple. If early humans reached places they were not expected to reach, with skills they were not expected to have, then what else did they know that we have forgotten? And if the world's unreachable places were reached too early, perhaps it is not the people who were ahead of their time, but our understanding that remains behind. There is a silence in the polar regions unlike any other, a silence so complete it feels almost sentient, as if the ice itself were listening. Beneath the frozen surfaces of Antarctica and the Arctic lies a geological memory older than civilization, older than humanity's settled life, older even than the myths that brush against the edges of our imagination. These regions, now locked beneath miles of ice, were not always empty. They were not always unbearable. And the more scientists learn about their deep past, the more unsettling the implications become. It is not just that these landscapes once supported life. It is that they may have supported people, or at least cultures, during periods long erased by the encroaching cold. Antarctica, for example, is not a monolithic block of ice. Beneath its white mantle lie mountain ranges, valleys, freshwater lakes, and entire river systems. The peaks of the Gamburtsev Mountains, hidden under 2 miles of ice, rise as sharply as the Alps. Lake Vostok, sealed away for millions of years, contains liquid water beneath the crushing pressure, kept alive by geothermal heat from below. When radar mapping first revealed these landscapes, scientists were stunned by their complexity. This was not the empty void described in early world maps. This was a continent with geography, history, and above all, secrets. Climatologists now believe Antarctica may have been ice-free during certain periods within the last few 100,000 years. Some estimates push the last fully ice-free state back much further, into epochs predating modern humans, but other models suggest partial melting and habitable coasts during warmer interglacial periods. If even a fraction of these models are accurate, then regions of Antarctica could have been accessible to early humans or pre-modern hominins, at times when we assume they were nowhere near the poles. Yet the geological record beneath the ice remains inaccessible, its story locked behind one of the most impenetrable barriers on Earth. And then there are the maps. The Peary Race map of 1513, compiled from older sources, famously depicts what appears to be the coastline of Antarctica without ice, a geographical detail Europeans could not have known. The map is controversial, but its existence raises a question that resists comfortable answers. How did anyone, ancient or otherwise, obtain knowledge of a coastline buried under ice for millennia? Scholars propose explanations ranging from misidentified islands to accidental accuracy, yet the issue refuses to settle. The coastline, if interpreted correctly, suggests a memory of a world that no longer exists, but the Antarctic mystery is only half the story. The Arctic, too, hides its own forgotten worlds. During the last interglacial period, vast tracts of what is now the Siberian tundra were temperate grasslands. Mammoths, horses, rhinoceroses, and humans roamed these lands freely. The melting of permafrost today reveals this former world in disturbing detail. Preserved carcasses with intact skin, tools frozen in layers predating known migrations. Even pollen signatures hinting at forests where none exist today. One of the most curious pieces of evidence emerges from Yana rhinoceros horn site in Siberia, where archaeologists discovered human occupation dating back 31,000 years, far earlier than expected for such high latitudes. These people were not merely passing through. They built structures, crafted tools, hunted large mammals, and survived winters that modern humans would find impossible without advanced preparation. They may have inherited knowledge from groups that lived in these regions long before the last great freeze. Knowledge we cannot easily trace. In Greenland, ice core samples reveal not only climatic cycles, but traces of plant DNA, suggesting that parts of Greenland were ice-free within the last million years, possibly even during the time anatomically modern humans existed. If so, Greenland may have once been a corridor of migration, a forgotten nexus between continents. But what makes these polar mysteries truly haunting is not their scientific intrigue. It is the faint human resonance beneath them. Consider the legends of a land at the top of the world. Many cultures speak of a northern homeland, Hyperborea, in Greek lore, a place beyond the north wind, where the sun shone for half the year. The Vedic tradition mentions Uttarakuru, a distant northern realm of great abundance. Inuit stories recall migrations from lands now buried under ice. Norse mythology describes Niflheim, a frozen world older than the gods themselves. These are not proof, but they are reminders that human imagination gravitates toward memory, and memory often gravitates toward loss. Could these myths echo real landscapes? Fertile, habitable regions now sealed beneath ice sheets? Could they preserve fragments of oral history passed down through tens of thousands of years, distorted but not destroyed? If humans occupied northern climates during warm intervals, those settlements would now be unreachable. The ice, shifting and grinding, would erase all structural evidence. Only tools or bone fragments might survive, if they survived at all. And given the compression of ice over time, much of the record would be unrecognizable. We cannot excavate what has been crushed into geological strata. Yet despite this erasure, traces of human possibility remain. Some researchers propose that human dispersal into the Arctic required symbolic and technological sophistication, not reflected in genetic or archaeological data. The organization required to survive those environments suggests the presence of structured societies, not civilizations in the modern sense, but organized groups capable of passing down knowledge, rituals, and survival strategies. If such groups existed, they would have been forced south as climates shifted, carrying fragments of their world with them, fragments that later cultures transformed into myths of golden ages and lost lands. Then there is the matter of sudden disappearance. When ice advanced rapidly, entire ecosystems collapsed. Human groups would have fled or perished. Their settlements would have been swallowed. Their stories might have been carried southward, retold in warmer lands that had never seen the world of ice. Myths of frozen realms, sleeping gods, and catastrophic winters might be cultural memories of the last glacial surge, memories of a world ending in snow. Just as flood myths preserve memories of submerged lands, ice myths may preserve memories of frozen ones. But even these possibilities do not fully address the deeper questions, the ones that grow louder the more we consider what lies beneath the ice. If Antarctica and the Arctic once held lands capable of supporting human life, did those lands foster traditions that influenced later cultures? Could early humans have migrated through these regions long before our conventional timelines allow? And if they did, what knowledge did they carry with them into the warmer world? We often imagine human prehistory as isolated pockets of development, disconnected communities scattered across continents. But Ice Age migrations tell a different story, one of immense mobility, resilience, and adaptability. If humans could survive in the Arctic 30,000 years ago, why could they not have reached even stranger or more remote lands long before traditional archaeology suggests? The silence beneath the ice does not deny this possibility. It simply refuses to confirm it. But silence is not absence. Silence is a boundary between the world we know and the world we suspect might have existed. A boundary carved not by time, but by ice. And in the quiet hum of that boundary, one question lingers, cold and relentless. If the ice were to melt completely, if the world beneath were revealed, what forgotten human chapters might rise into the light once more? There is a peculiar discomfort that settles in the mind when confronting knowledge that appears before its supposed time, as though the past were leaning forward, whispering warnings we are not prepared to hear. Again and again, in dusty storerooms, buried tablets, worn stone surfaces, and fragile manuscripts, fragments of ancient understanding emerge that feel out of place, too advanced, too deliberate, too confident for cultures that, by our timeline, should have been fumbling in the dark. These anomalies do not proclaim lost civilizations. They do not need to. Their quiet existence is enough to trouble the foundations of the story we tell about human progress. Consider the stars. Long before the first cities, humans studied the night sky. But some ancient cultures possessed astronomical knowledge so precise that even modern researchers hesitate. The Babylonian clay tablet known as Plimpton, 322, dated to nearly 3,700 years ago, describes trigonometric relationships with a sophistication rivaling what would later be formalized in Greek mathematics. It is not simply arithmetic, it is structured thought, the kind that emerges after centuries of accumulated understanding. Yet the textbooks claim civilization was still young when the Babylonians recorded such ideas. If so, where did the intellectual lineage originate? Then there is the Nebra sky disk, unearthed in Germany, a bronze artifact from the Bronze Age depicting the sun moon, stars, and possibly the Pleiades. It is not a casual representation, but a conceptual one. It implies knowledge of celestial cycles, understanding of symbolic representation, and perhaps calendrical alignment. Its craftsmanship suggests inheritance, not invention. But from whom? Egypt offers its own puzzles. The pyramids, as overwhelming as they are not the only enigma. The subtle precision of their alignments, true north deviating by mere fractions, suggests an observational technique far older than the construction itself. Early Egyptian texts describe star cycles, precessional knowledge, and celestial rituals that seem inexplicably mature. If the Egyptians learned these systems gradually, the archaeological layers preceding them are almost suspiciously quiet. In India, the Sulba Sutras, ancient Vedic texts on altar geometry, contain geometric principles that precede formal proofs by millennia. They articulate the Pythagorean theorem long before Pythagoras. They encode ratios, transformations, and construction rules with an elegance that implies a long lineage of mathematical refinement. Yet the broader archaeological record offers no clear pathway showing how such sophistication emerged. When knowledge appears polished at its first recorded instance, one must wonder, what earlier tradition shaped it? The enigma deepens with early maps. The Piri race map is famous, but it is not alone. The Oronsfine map, the Boache map, and others hint at geographic knowledge older than the explorers who supposedly inspired them. Coastlines appear too accurate. Mountain ranges appear where no European cartographer had ever travelled. The maps themselves are products of their time, but their sources, the older authorities they reference, remain unknown. One interpretation is that ancient seafaring existed at levels we have not yet documented. Another is that fragments of much older geographical knowledge survived in oral or written form until medieval scholars copied them. Neither explanation is comfortable. Both imply a forgotten intellectual history. Astronomical anomalies complicate the picture further. At Nabta Playa in the Nubian desert, stones more than 7,000 years old mark solstices with surprising accuracy. This predates Stonehenge by thousands of years. The alignments appear intentional, ceremonial, and mathematical. They suggest that desert herders in the Neolithic understood celestial cycles deeply, perhaps because they inherited the knowledge from traditions older than the desert itself. And then there is the ancient knowledge embedded in myth. The Dogon people of Mali, for example, hold traditions describing the star Sirius and its invisible companion, details some scholars have argued they could not have known without telescopes. The issue is debated fiercely, and yet the complexity of the Dogon cosmology remains striking. It includes orbital periods, celestial cycles, and symbolic structures far older than contact with modern astronomy. Even if the details have been exaggerated or mistranslated, the underlying question remains. How did such remote traditions become entangled with advanced astronomical concepts? Elsewhere, myths describe cycles of time measured in tens of thousands of years. Hindu cosmology speaks of yugas lasting for vast cosmic ages. The Maya long count tracks celestial motions across epochs. Ancient Chinese texts reference precessional shifts and world ages. Some of these traditions may be symbolic, but symbolism does not arise in a vacuum. It grows from observation, memory, and cultural inheritance. And what of engineering? The mysterious drilling techniques at the Denisovan cave site, beads crafted with a level of precision not expected from Paleolithic humans, suggest that certain groups possessed skills far ahead of their supposed technological stage. Even more puzzling are the tool marks found on hard stone surfaces in Egypt and South America. Grooves, bores, and cuts that imply techniques we cannot easily match using copper tools. These are not proofs of advanced lost technologies. They are reminders that our assumptions about ancient capabilities may be incomplete. The question threads through all these anomalies like a quiet river. How does knowledge appear where it should not? One answer is cultural diffusion, ideas spreading from older groups to newer ones. But diffusion requires time, and the archaeological record does not always provide it. Another answer is independent invention, parallel innovation across continents. But the level of similarity across early traditions challenges this. A third possibility, the most unsettling, is that humanity once possessed a broader intellectual foundation that fragmented during periods of climatic or social collapse. Knowledge could have survived in pockets, scattered, partial, disguised in myth, only to reappear thousands of years later when conditions allowed. If this were true, then the sudden intellectual blooms in early civilizations would not be anomalies. They would be resurgences. Even the earliest writing systems support this idea. When cuneiform and hieroglyphics appear, they do so fully formed, not as crude early prototypes, but as mature systems. The same is true for early accounting tablets, early astronomical logs, early medical texts. Their sophistication suggests a long pre-literate tradition that left little trace. Consider the possibility that writing did not mark the beginning of knowledge, but the moment knowledge became stable enough to survive collapse. Before that, memory lived in ritual, song, symbol, and mind. Perhaps the reason ancient knowledge feels uncanny is not because it was advanced, but because it was inherited. The faint residue of an earlier world where observation, survival, and cosmology were intertwined. A world erased not by single catastrophe, but by the slow grinding of time. Still, one cannot ignore the deeper question. Why does so much early knowledge appear incomplete? Why do we find fragments? Never the full system, never the origin, only the echoes. Maybe the people who held that knowledge did not survive the transitions between ages. Maybe only parts of their intellectual legacy endured, scattered among cultures that could not fully reconstruct it. Or perhaps some knowledge was guarded, deliberately obscured, passed down only through symbolic forms until its meaning dimmed. And yet, every time a fragment is uncovered, a tablet, a carving, a disc, a map, it seems to gesture toward the same possibility. That humanity is not encountering new mysteries, but remembering old ones. And if the earliest civilizations inherited knowledge from a world that no longer exists, then the question that rises quietly from the ruins is simple, almost painful. What would the full picture look like if we could ever recover the pieces that time has hidden? There is a quiet, nearly imperceptible shift that occurs when one studies history long enough. A moment when the past stops looking incomplete and begins looking curated. The gaps no longer feel accidental. The silences no longer feel innocent. Instead, they resemble omissions, shaped by the hands of those who survived, those who ruled, those who wrote. Human history is not merely what happened, it is what was selected to endure. And when one begins to see the contours of that selection, a darker question emerges. How much of the deep past was lost by chance, and how much was lost by design? Empires rise not only by conquering land, but by controlling memory. The stories a civilization tells about itself shape the world as surely as architecture or warfare. And throughout recorded time, certain institutions, kingdoms, priesthoods, academies, colonial powers, have acted not just as chroniclers of the past, but as editors of it. Their hands appear faintly, selectively, erasing or reshaping narratives that threatened their authority or contradicted the worldview they needed to maintain. This becomes particularly troubling when examining the earliest fragments of human knowledge, the pieces that survived collapse and catastrophe. They reach us through filters, rewritten myths, selective translations, religious canons, imperial archives, academic gatekeeping. The past is not presented whole, it is presented acceptable. Consider the ancient libraries, not the ones that survived, but the ones that burned. The Library of Alexandria, whose destruction remains a wound in the collective memory of humanity, contained texts older than any surviving manuscript. It preserved astronomical observations, mathematical treatises, histories of vanished cultures, and works that may have traced human knowledge back into prehistoric times. Only fragments remain, references to works we can no longer read. Names of books that now exist only as ghosts, a whisper of knowledge erased. But Alexandria was not an anomaly. The library of Ashurbanipal was buried and rediscovered only by accident. Countless scrolls from the Mediterranean burned during the Roman conquests. Early texts from the Indus Valley remain undeciphered, their meaning locked away by the loss of whatever tradition once gave them context. Much of the Maya codicial tradition was destroyed by missionaries who considered the knowledge dangerous or false. Even in medieval Europe, heretical works were systematically purged, leaving only preserved refutations in their place. Each destruction reshapes the map of human memory. Each erasure deepens the silence. But erasing books is only one piece of a larger pattern. Throughout history, dominant institutions curated origin stories, stories that placed themselves at the center. Anything that contradicted the narrative of linear progress, divine authority, or cultural primacy was either downplayed or lost. The idea of a world older, stranger, or more sophisticated than the sanctioned version was not welcomed. Even the field of archaeology, for all its incredible achievements, inherited some of these biases. Early archaeologists worked under assumptions shaped by their time. The belief that civilization emerged suddenly in a few chosen regions, that progress was linear, that ancient peoples were primitive until proven otherwise. Findings that contradicted these frameworks were often dismissed, delayed, or ridiculed, not always maliciously, but because they did not fit the expected model. Göbekli Tepe is a perfect example. When first discovered, its significance was minimized because a monumental site predating agriculture contradicted everything scholars believed about early humanity. Its re-evaluation took decades. Other sites, submerged ruins, anomalous stone structures, out-of-place artifacts, have faced similar resistance. It is not that the evidence is absent, but that interpretation is selective. Yet the most subtle form of suppression is not destruction or denial. It is reinterpretation. When myths of earlier ages describe advanced knowledge, those details are reclassified as metaphor. When symbolic systems imply astronomical precision, the assumption becomes coincidence or projection. When oral traditions speak of lost homelands or cycles of catastrophe, they are treated as narrative flourishes rather than possible memories. The past is domesticated, quietly made obedient to our expectations. But one must wonder, what if these stories are not exaggerations, but the remnants of a worldview that predates recorded civilization? What if the myths were never meant to describe gods at all, but people or cultures whose memory survived in distorted form? What if the technological jumps of early civilizations were not spontaneous, but inherited from traditions we cannot see? This possibility becomes uncomfortable because it challenges the foundational belief that progress is modern, that we are the apex, that our ancestors slowly climbed from ignorance into enlightenment. If humanity once possessed knowledge that later collapsed, whether through climate catastrophe, population bottlenecks, or the slow erosion of oral memory, then the story of civilization becomes cyclical, not linear. And cyclical histories do not comfort modern sensibilities, but there is another layer, a more deliberate one, that shapes how we perceive deep time. During the age of exploration, colonial powers reinterpreted ancient histories to fit political aims. Archaeological finds were framed to emphasize the superiority of certain cultures. Competing origin stories were suppressed. In some cases, evidence of cultural continuity was severed to justify conquest. These decisions, though political at the time, became academic dogma. They shape our maps of prehistory even now. Religious authorities also curated the deep past. Chronologies were rewritten to align with theological frameworks. Knowledge inconsistent with sacred narratives was condemned or sidelined. Even when scientific discoveries emerged, they were often forced into compromise with long-standing beliefs. This tension colored the way early archaeologists viewed their own findings, and academics themselves, operating within institutions that value consensus, sometimes treat anomalies with suspicion simply because the cost of being wrong or challenging foundational models is too high. Careers hinge on adhering to narratives that can be defended. Radical reinterpretations require more evidence than the past is able to give. And so, the silence persists, not because the evidence is absent, but because the frameworks cannot yet accommodate it. But every so often, the past pushes back. A tablet reveals unexpected mathematics. A site predates agriculture. A symbol aligns with the celestial cycles far older than expected. A genetic lineage appears with no known ancestors. And when these fragments emerge, they do not rewrite history outright. They do something far more troubling. They highlight the shape of the void, the outline of what used to be there. Suppression does not need to be malicious to be real. It can arise from misunderstanding, fear, convenience, or simple human preference for orderly stories. Yet the effect is the same. The older layers of human history fade, not only through natural loss, but through curated forgetting. And this forgetting has a peculiar consequence. It isolates us. It makes us believe we are the first to walk the long path from ignorance to knowledge. It severs us from the idea that we might be part of a cycle, inheritors of fragments from a world erased. If humanity once lived through ages more complex than we acknowledge, then the institutions that shaped our histories, consciously or not, have obscured not only the facts, but the very possibility. And in the quiet where these omissions accumulate, a question unfurls, slow and solemn. If history was rewritten to fit the world we wanted, what would our story look like if we allowed the past to speak for itself? Raw, unfiltered, and older than we dare imagine. There is a particular kind of silence that settles around discoveries which do not fit the story we have agreed to tell. It is not the silence of absence, nor the silence of forgotten things. It is a deliberate, brittle quiet. The kind that forms when something has been found, but no one quite knows what to do with it. Now and then, an archaeologist uncovers something unexpected, a layer older than the one above it, a tool where no people were thought to exist, a structure whose date strains the limits of accepted chronology. And instead of celebration, there is hesitation. Meetings, reinterpretations, funding withdrawn, excavations paused, reports softened. The pattern is not uniform, yet it appears often enough to suggest an unspoken truth. Certain discoveries frighten institutions. The reasons are rarely conspiratorial. They are structural. Entire academic disciplines are built on painstakingly assembled chronologies. Reputations hinge on stability. A single anomaly may be tolerated, even welcomed. But dozens of anomalies? Patterns that threaten the scaffolding? Those are far more difficult to absorb. And because institutions move slowly, cautiously, protectively, the past sometimes becomes a territory that must be defended rather than explored. Consider the case of the Topper site in South Carolina. When Albert Goodyear uncovered evidence suggesting human activity more than 50,000 years old, far older than the Clovis culture once considered the first in the Americas, he faced intense resistance. Not because the science was inherently flawed, but because the implications were too disruptive. If humans were in the Americas tens of thousands of years earlier than expected, then migration models, tool typologies, and even linguistic hypotheses would require re-evaluation. The pushback was immediate. Funding wavered. Papers languished. Yet over time, other sites, Monteverde, Bluefish Caves, Chiquihuit, began to echo a similar timeline. The field shifted, reluctantly, but the path from discovery to acceptance stretched across decades. Another example comes from the Zana Valley in Africa, where megalithic stone circles and platform structures lie largely unstudied. Local archaeologists suggest they may be thousands of years older than comparable sites nearby. Yet research is sparse. Not due to lack of interest, but lack of institutional support. The site does not fit the dominant model of centralized cultural emergence, making it easy to overlook. Without sustained funding, anomalies remain anomalies, shadows at the edge of the map. Off the coast of India, in the Gulf of Cambay, sonar revealed rectilinear formations beneath 70 meters of water. The initial findings sparked excitement, but immediately met resistance. Some oceanographers argued that natural formations could produce similar patterns. Others questioned the dating of artifacts dredged from the site. Instead of a comprehensive multidisciplinary investigation, the project faded under the weight of controversy. The sea continued to hide whatever secrets remained, while the scientific debate dissolved into silence. Even underwater archaeology faces political pressures. Sites that challenge national or cultural narratives may receive limited attention. Others become entangled in diplomatic tensions, their excavation postponed indefinitely. In these cases, suppression is quiet, bureaucratic, a matter of priorities rather than hostility. But the most subtle suppression happens when evidence is simply reinterpreted into harmlessness. A set of strange carvings becomes ritual decoration. A structure with astronomical alignment becomes accidental. A layer of occupation significantly older than expected becomes intrusive fill. These explanations may be correct. Sometimes they are. But the convenience can be difficult to ignore. When an anomaly threatens an established framework, the simplest solution is to fold it back into the narrative, smoothing the edges until it no longer interrupts. Yet, across the world, there are discoveries that refuse to be smoothed out. At Denisova Cave, the precision-crafted stone bracelet with drilled holes perplexed researchers. Its near-perfect symmetry and high-speed drilling marks seemed inconsistent with the technology attributed to its makers. The scientific papers described the methods of analysis meticulously, yet the broader implications were rarely discussed. If Denisovans had such advanced craftsmanship, what else might they have developed? What knowledge left no trace because no one yet knows how to look for it? In Turkey, The vast complex at Karahan Tepe, older than Göbekli Tepe, continues to surprise excavators. Some structures appear intentionally buried. Others contain forms that defy easy interpretation. The site challenges the assumption that monumental architecture followed agriculture. And as more layers emerge, the timeline stretches, and the questions deepen. Even so, discussion remains cautious, careful, provisional. Progress moves at the speed permission allows. In Peru, the Ica region holds petroglyphs and geoglyphs that remain understudied due to funding limitations and concerns about pseudoscientific speculation. Serious researchers express frustration. Too many anomalies exist in landscapes overshadowed by sensationalism. Legitimate avenues of inquiry become politically fraught, and so exploration stalls. The stones wait unexamined. In Africa, the stone complexes of southern Zimbabwe, Great Zimbabwe, and related sites once suffered from explicit ideological suppression. Colonial-era scholars refused to believe Africans built them. They attributed the structures to outsiders until overwhelming evidence forced a correction. But this history serves as a reminder. Academic narratives can be shaped by prejudice, by politics, by the need for control. Suppression does not always hide older worlds. Sometimes it hides truths about recent ones. Yet the most profound suppression may be the quietest: the absence of interdisciplinary work. Academic boundaries, archaeology, geology, anthropology, astronomy, often isolate discoveries that should be studied together. A site with unusual celestial alignments may not be examined by astronomers. Geological events with archaeological implications may be interpreted separately. The past becomes fragmented by the modern categories used to study it, and in that fragmentation, deeper patterns remain unseen. This fragmentation is not malicious, it is structural, but it creates a form of unintentional suppression, the inability to perceive what does not fit neatly into a single field. And still, beneath every example, a more unsettling possibility whispers. Perhaps certain discoveries frighten institutions because they suggest that our species is older, more cyclical, more fragile, and more complex than we allow ourselves to believe. They hint at resets, lost ages, forgotten ingenuity. They suggest that humanity may have risen before, only to fall and rise again. If true, then our current world is not the first iteration, but one of many. Such an idea is not welcomed in disciplines built on linear progress. Yet the anomalies persist, chipping away at that comforting line, revealing something more jagged beneath. Eventually, one must confront the question: are these discoveries truly rare, or do we simply fail to recognize them? Archaeology depends on what survives. History depends on what is written. Science depends on what is funded, and memory depends on who carries it forward. In that fragile chain, countless things can fall through. Entire stories can vanish, entire ages can be forgotten, and entire discoveries can remain buried because no institution is ready to accept them. Perhaps the real mystery is not what has been uncovered, but what has been quietly set aside, waiting for a world willing to see without fear. And so a final question rises, soft and steady. If the past were allowed to speak without restraint, if nothing were dismissed, minimized, or reinterpreted for comfort, how different would our understanding of ourselves truly be? There is a moment, subtle, almost imperceptible, when the vast sweep of human history begins to resemble not a rising line, but a broken ladder. A rung missing here, another shattered there. The climb continues, yet the continuity falters. And as one steps back to look at the whole structure, a strange sensation emerges, the sense that the human story we inherit is only the upper portion of something far taller, whose lower sections have been lost in darkness. What we call the beginning of civilization might only be the point where the surviving ladder becomes visible again. This realization grows slowly, like a low hum accumulating beneath the surface. It begins with the abrupt emergence of cities, writing, agriculture, astronomy. It deepens with the unexplained sophistication of early myths and symbols. It widens with the presence of ghost lineages and forgotten migrations. And by the time one reaches the anomalies, the submerged settlements, the unplaceable stones, something becomes undeniable. The story of humanity is missing its middle. The archaeological record shows humanity present for hundreds of thousands of years, scattered across continents, adapting, innovating, gathering, crafting. Yet the cultural record, the one we can trace through writing, architecture, and sustained knowledge, spans barely 6,000 years. What happened between those two timescales? Where are the echoes of the hundreds of millennia of human thought? Where are the experiments, the failures, the sparks of genius, the early expressions of society? Did all those generations leave no enduring trace? The easy answer is that time erases, and indeed, most things dissolve. Wood rots, skin vanishes, stories fade. Rivers migrate and bury settlements beneath sediment. Fire destroys memory. Ice crushes everything beneath it. And yet, humans are stubborn. We leave marks even when we do not intend to. If millions of people lived and died through the deep Pleistocene, it seems improbable that all their societal trajectories vanished without so much as a lingering architectural footprint. Unless something interrupted them. Unless something repeatedly interrupted them. This is where the broken ladder reveals its shape. Human development does not show a smooth ascent. It is punctuated, fragmented, a series of beginnings layered on the ruins of earlier attempts. Evidence suggests cycles, expansions and contractions, dispersals and resets. After the Younger Dryas, after the Toba eruption, after glacial surges, after megafaunal extinctions. Each time the world changed, humanity changed with it. But did those changes erase more than landscapes? Did they erase continuity itself? One begins to notice how often early cultural expressions seem like survivors, not pioneers. The earliest writing systems appear fully formed, as if stabilized after a long evolution elsewhere. Monumental architecture emerges abruptly in the Neolithic, yet its symbolic roots trace back tens of thousands of years to cave walls. Mathematics in early civilizations appears polished, mature, as though refined long before being etched into clay. Navigation, present in the earliest seafaring cultures, does not resemble experimentation. It resembles tradition. And yet the traditions themselves, their scaffolding, remain invisible. It is as though humanity climbed once, fell, lost its footing, climbed again, fell again, each time losing part of the knowledge, but keeping enough fragments to rebuild. Perhaps this is why early myths describe cycles rather than linear origins. Worlds created and destroyed, ages rising and collapsing, floods that cleanse, fires that purify, skies that fall and then rebirth themselves. Deep time, reflected through human memory, is not steady. It is episodic. If there was a world before our recorded world, even if it was not a civilization as we imagine, but a network of cultures sharing knowledge across continents, what would remain of it after 10 or 20,000 years? Almost nothing. And yet, almost nothing is still something. It is the faint residue of memory that seems to cling to humanity's oldest stories, to the earliest symbols, to the sudden reappearance of knowledge at the dawn of recorded history. This incomplete continuity changes how one interprets the ancient world. Consider the religious cosmologies of Egypt, Mesopotamia, Mesoamerica, India. All describe ages before the present one. All speak of ancestors who lived differently, who understood differently, who fell or were destroyed, or simply stepped aside for a new epoch. These stories are dismissed as mythic cycles, yet they could just as easily be distorted memories of real generational collapses carried forward by survivors into their rebuilt worlds. One begins to wonder whether the knowledge of early civilizations was not the first flowering of human wisdom, but the last flicker of something older, something that endured long enough to seed the new world before fading from memory. If the middle of the human story is missing, then the beginning is not where we think it is. The beginning is invisible. It lies somewhere in the long night between our biological emergence and our historical appearance. In that darkness, cultures rose and fell. Humans navigated coasts now drowned beneath the sea. Populations vanished during glacial advances. Entire intellectual traditions may have flourished in regions now erased by deserts or submerged under continental shelves. What if the real puzzle is not why civilization took so long to arise, but why it rose so quickly once the world stabilized? What if the suddenness of early civilizations reflects not invention, but recovery, the reknitting of knowledge across scattered human groups who retained fragments of something older? This broken middle hypothesis casts new light on known mysteries. The rapid spread of agriculture across the Fertile Crescent, the recurrence of megalithic construction in unrelated cultures, the early mathematics and astronomy that appear without gradual development, the persistence of symbolic systems across vast stretches of time, the deep myths shared across continents. These clues no longer seem disconnected. They resemble the edges of a shattered mosaic, pieces of an older image that, when aligned just right, hint at coherence. And yet the human mind resists this, not because the evidence is implausible, but because the implications are uncomfortable. If humanity's past includes forgotten cycles, then our present is not the apex of progress, merely the latest plateau, and the future is not guaranteed to follow the upward line we expect. Civilizations can collapse. Knowledge can be lost. The ladder can break again. Perhaps this is why institutions prefer the narrative of linear ascent. It reassures, it comforts, it anchors us in the belief that we are moving forward inevitably. But the archaeological record, the genetic record, and the mythological record whisper a different story, one shaped by disruption, erasure, rediscovery. A ladder climbing out of darkness, missing half its rungs. And if that is true, then humanity is not standing at the peak of its own creation. It is standing somewhere in the middle, atop layers of forgotten worlds, beneath which lie others still older. The silence beneath us is not empty. It is dense, heavy with unrealized memory. And so the question that lingers, quiet and unhurried, is this: if we could descend through the missing rungs into the worlds that rose before our own, what version of humanity would we find waiting in the dark? There is a peculiar stillness that settles when one reaches the threshold of memory, the place where the known world dissolves into something softer, dimmer, older. It is not quite darkness, but a haze, like fog drifting across a landscape at dawn. The familiar shapes of history fade here, replaced by impressions, echoes, silhouettes of forgotten ages. And as humanity stands at this edge, Contemplating the vastness behind us, an almost instinctual feeling takes shape. The sense that our story did not begin where we believe it did. That what we call the beginning of civilization is only the first chapter that survived, not the first that was written. This sense becomes strongest at night, when the mind relaxes and the noise of modern life recedes. One begins to feel the weight of time differently, not as a line stretching backward, but as a layered presence, each age pressing faintly against the next. In those moments, it is tempting to imagine the earliest humans as primitive, unknowing, adrift in a world they scarcely understood. But that image grows fragile the more one studies the evidence. Instead, a different picture emerges. People who observed the sky with patience, who crafted symbols enduring tens of thousands of years, who adapted to unimaginable climates, who crossed seas long before recorded history says they could, who buried their dead with reverence, who remembered cycles of destruction and renewal. Humanity may not be the product of one rise, but of many. Ascents and collapses, expansions and contractions, memory and forgetting. If this is true, then the deep past is not an empty silence, but a crowded one, filled with the ghosts of earlier worlds. Not ghost civilizations in the sensational sense, but ghost versions of ourselves, cultures that learned, experimented, failed, survived, or perished. Their traces exist in scattered clues. A stone circle too old, a tool too sophisticated, a symbol too widespread. A genetic lineage without a known ancestor. None of these alone carries the weight of revelation, but together they sketch the outline of something larger, a humanity that has lived more than one age. Standing at this threshold, the question is no longer whether something existed before the civilizations we recognize. It is what form that something took. Perhaps early humanity developed a kind of knowledge that did not rely on permanence. Maybe their wisdom lived in memory, ritual, and movement, not in architecture or metallurgy. When the world changed, when ice advanced, seas rose, climates shifted, their knowledge drifted with them, carried from group to group until its origins blurred. What remains today might be residue, fragments of myths, patterns in symbols, the uncanny sophistication of early observations. Or perhaps earlier expressions were material but fragile. Cultures living along coastlines would have built with wood, fibre, reeds, materials devoured by water and time. Ice Age rivers shifted violently, burying settlements. Volcanic eruptions erased landscapes. Floods could wipe clean everything except the faintest traces, and each catastrophe would have forced survivors into new regions, leaving behind abandoned worlds that later ages never rediscovered. Yet there is another possibility, the most unsettling of all. What if some knowledge was carried intentionally into the next age by survivors who understood that a collapse had come? What if the earliest astronomers, the earliest navigators, the earliest mathematicians were not pioneers, but inheritors? People trying to reconstruct what they could of a shattered intellectual world. People whose descendants eventually built the first cities, unaware that they were piecing together only fragments of a much older puzzle. This would explain the strange maturity of early civilizations, their confident use of mathematics, their sudden grasp of agriculture, their alignment with celestial cycles. Not because they invented these things from nothing, but because the knowledge had been distilled through memory, myth, and necessity. It would also explain why the earliest records of humanity feel like they begin in the middle of something, as though the prologue had been torn away. But if this is true, then the question becomes, what happened before the tearing? Why did earlier ages fall? Was it climate alone? The ice, the floods, the droughts? Was it competition with other human species? Was it disease, scarcity, or war? Or was it something quieter, something more human? The gradual erosion of knowledge as populations dispersed, elders died, and traditions faded. Collapses need not be dramatic to be complete. Sometimes forgetting is enough. And yet, despite all the forgetting, something endured. A subtle thread runs through early myths, early symbols, early structures. It is the idea of recurrence. The world has ended before. Humanity has started again. Time is not a straight line, but a cycle, a wheel, a spiral. Nearly every ancient culture articulates this in one form or another. Ages destroyed by water, by fire, by darkness. Ages of innocence, ages of knowledge, ages of decay. Why would cultures separated by oceans describe the same pattern unless they were remembering something deeper than myth, something inherited from the dimmest edges of human experience? Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the dark age before humanity rose is not that it existed, but that it left so little behind. An age cannot be reconstructed through whispers and shadows. Yet sometimes shadows say more than objects. They hint at a world whose absence feels strangely deliberate, not in the sense of a conspiracy, but in the sense of an old wound. A trauma so immense that memory itself recoiled. And now, after thousands of years, we feel something stir at the edges of that wound. Archaeology grows more sensitive. Genetics reaches further back. Climate data uncovers older landscapes. Underwater mapping reveals drowned worlds. Slowly, humanity approaches the threshold of its own forgotten history. But standing here, at the quiet end of this long exploration, the answer does not matter as much as the shift in perception. The past no longer feels like a closed book. It feels like a deep cavern, one we have barely entered. Its echoes are faint, but they shape us. They reach through myth, symbol, instinct, and curiosity. We are not the first humans to wonder who came before. That question is older than writing, older than agriculture, older than memory itself. It is a question that has accompanied every age of humanity, spoken around fires, whispered in temples, etched onto stone, carried in songs. And perhaps that is the greatest clue of all. The question survives because its answer once mattered. As this journey closes, nothing resolves fully, nothing settles. The past remains blurred, unreachable, shimmering. Yet in that shimmering uncertainty lies something strangely comforting. A reminder that humanity is part of a lineage much longer and more mysterious than the narrow span we call history. And so, the final question lingers gently in the air, like the last note of a forgotten melody. If the beginning of our story is hidden behind a veil of lost ages, then what does it mean to be human in a world whose first chapters we may never fully read?